Hi, Miss Parents, students. This is about the rocky shore.
Anything else? You want to tell them what's in that picture?
It is an octopus, and a coral, and some coral reef.
It's a rocky shore. Those are sea urchins.
There are sea urchins.
In the rocky shore. Did you ever swim by a sea urchin before? When we were on the cruise?
And there are like fish in the background.
There are some fish, yeah. Is there a lot of organisms?
So it's called the rocky shore. Thank
you. If there's a lot of organisms, it's biodiverse. Can you say biodiverse?
Biodiverse.
That's good. Thank you. Good job.
So is that going to send it to them?
Yeah, it's recording still. Okay, and in this section, we're going to look at the different zones because of how high the tide goes. It creates different type of conditions, and certain organisms are adapted for that. How the biotic and abiotic factors will interact to push these organisms into, like I said, different zones. That's called zonation. And of course, just like sandy shores, we're going to need to hone in on just a few different named examples.
It's an exam.
There will be an exam.
I know.
Abiotic factors at the rocky shore. There's a handful of them. So one is going to be fluctuating temperatures. This is pretty similar to the sandy shore. But remember, water has a high heat capacity. There's much more water at the shoreline than there's at the sandy shore. Water has a high heat capacity, and so it can hold on to temperature really well, and that's because of all of its hydrogen bonds. There's so many hydrogen bonds, and those bonds can hang on to the thermal energy. So it's going to maintain its temperature really well. Temperature is going to fluctuate a lot whenever there is low tide, because then these organisms in the lower tidal region are going to be exposed to the air, and again, air does not have a high heat capacity. It changes pretty quickly. They need to adapt to salinity changes, and honestly, the next slide I have more details about when these things are going to happen, so I'll just read through them. Strong wave action. Rocky shores, when you be thinking about strong waves. Exposure to air based on the tidal cycles. So twice a day, low tide, there's going to be a lot of the organisms exposed to air. The slope of the shore, the type of rock that makes up the substrate, what region the habitat is in, whether it's temperate or is it tropical, sunlight availability. There might be some areas in the rock where sun is not able to shine, and obviously it's going to limit photosynthesis. And if it's limiting photosynthesis, then it's limiting productivity. But despite all of these factors, the rocky shores have high biodiversity, and we're going to find out why. So specifically, how these abiotic factors are going to affect the organisms at the rocky shore and why are we even mentioning them? Like I said, fluctuating temperature. With water having the higher heat capacity, it's going to maintain its temperature more. But why do we care about temperature at all when we talk about organisms? Recall from regular biology or pre-AICE biology or whatever biology that you took before this class, temperature determines enzyme activity and how well enzymes are functioning. The job of enzymes is to make chemical reactions happen faster, and we'd all be dead without them. So would everything that's alive. So when enzymes are working really well, typically those organisms are in their optimum temperature. For humans, it's 98.6. I'm always floating at like a 97.5. Anyway, too cold, enzymes are going to work really slowly. Metabolism is going to be very slow. Too hot, enzymes are going to denature. And when enzymes denature, that means that they're changing their shape. If they change their shape, they are not able to catalyze or speed up the same reactions that they were before because they don't fit. In biology, the example is that an enzyme fits the molecules that it's going to be catalyzing or putting together. It fits them like a lock fits a key. And so if the lock is getting its shape changed, then the key is never going to fit back in it again. We see this being a problem with humans when we have fevers and we need to bring those fevers down right away. It's always an emergency because too high of a fever could start to cook our brains and our eyes, and it can cause seizures. It can cause paralysis. It can cause some sort of organ failures. It can say blindness. It can cause blindness. But all of those problems that can arise from fevers are all because our proteins are getting cooked. Fun fact, our eyes can cook like an egg. Okay. Anyways, fluctuating temperatures also can cause water loss because of osmosis, which will lead to desiccation. The water loss is because the tide pools are going to actually increase in salinity, and even we know that if we're drinking salt water or we are submerged in salt water, we're going to start to lose water. This will happen to marine organisms too, even though they do have adaptations for this happening. It still can happen at a greater rate whenever the salinity is pretty high. Salinity changes. High evaporation rates and tide pools can cause an increase in salinity, and this is a problem for the dissolved oxygen in the water. If you remember from first semester, whenever water has more dissolved solids in it, there's not enough space for dissolved gases to stay in there. And oxygen is needed for respiration by everything that's alive. So if we have high salinity, there's not going to be the same amount of space that can hold dissolved gases. Strong wave action is going to affect the ability to attach, and exposure to air based on the tidal cycle will also lead to desiccation because, again, you're going to have 2 low tides a day in most places. We're just going to go with semi-diurnal tidal phases. But most places are going to have 2 low tides a day, so those organisms are going to be exposed twice a day to the air, and they need to be able to adapt to that. Our remaining factors, the slope of the shore. This will affect the ease of attachment, or their ability to be able to attach, and again, how easy it is. So if you remember from section 2.2, morphology of shores, when we're looking at morphology, right, we consider sediment size, we consider slope. The slope of rocky shores could be vertical cliffs all the way to flat rocks. So if it's vertical, just gravity's going to have a major factor on you too. So it's harder to hang from the side than it is to be laying flat on something. Simple as that. The type of rocks that make up the substrate. I'm a fan of plate tectonics. I'm not a fan of rocks. I say that all the time. So you don't have to know different types of rocks. But just in general, smoother rocks are harder to attach to. They don't have that rough or porous of a substrate. It's not as textured. It's not a rough substrate. Rougher substrates allow for some grit, something for organisms to attach to. The region of the habitat, so this is like where it is like latitudinally on the planet. Tropical regions are warmer, but the temperature is more consistent. And by warmer, I should have put hotter. It's much hotter. But the temperature is more consistent. So you really just need to adapt to hot temperatures. That's what you need to do. In temperate areas where there's seasons, then you can have major changes in temperature. In the summer, you're going to have hot summers. And then in the winter, it could be places where it's going to snow, and then you're at a freezing temperature. So you need to be able to adapt to having hot sun in the summer and then snow in the winter. Sunlight availability, as mentioned before. So this is going to affect the ability to photosynthesize. If there is any kind of producer that's getting some sort of like shadow cast on it, or even they're just prevented from getting full sunlight penetration because maybe they attached too far into a rock, that's going to affect the rate of photosynthesis. And the rate of photosynthesis is productivity. Features on a rocky shore. So mainly this is going to be about how organisms are going to arrange themselves, situate themselves. We're going to call it zoning. Rocky shores are going to provide really good stability and suitable habitat for the species that are living there. The rocky substrate provides a lot of places for organisms to attach to. This is necessary for their survival, of course, because waves can wash them away. over time, time being the main factor, you could have weathering, right? Breaking down of those rocks from over time. You remember your 3 different kinds of weathering is chemical, organic, and physical. All those things can be happening on the rocky shore, but those rocks are very strong. They're very dense. They're very resistant to erosion and to weathering. But of course, time can change all that. The main resource that organisms compete for, I would highlight this, bold it, whatever you need to do, put a star by it. But the main resource organisms compete for is going to be space, space to attach, space to be in their optimal area for feeding, and then to avoid predation. So here in the pink box, just laser pointer. Okay, so starting right here. So to reduce competition, species are going to space themselves vertically, right up and down on the rocks, and this is called zonation. So it's kind of how organisms are going to space themselves out. Species will zone themselves based on their limits for survival. So it's pretty much like, how much do I not want to die from getting consumed by a predator? And how much like torture can I take from being exposed to the elements? They will zone themselves within those limits. Here are those limits. Our upper limit is determined by the abiotic factors that are affecting survival. So things like how tolerant they are to temperature changes, the length of time they can spend out of the water before desiccation. The lower limit is going to be the biotic factors. Your biotic factors are going to be competition for space between other species and risk of predation. So, you know, how much can an organism withstand being exposed to the sun, to changing temperatures, to waves crashing on them, to being exposed to air, maybe some wind, and then how much do I want to fight to get the space that I want in the rocky shore so I can attach. Also, I don't want to die from predation, so there has to be some sort of middle ground. Ideally, every organism would like to attach in your lower tide area because they can pretty much guarantee themselves to be covered all the time, and it's wonderful. But there will be a ton of competition. So you can have organisms that are like, all right, like something's got to give. I can also survive if I live a little bit higher up on the rocks. And so what? I have to deal with, the sun or being exposed to air, temperature changes, all that jazz. So what? I have to be exposed to that. That's fine. I can tolerate it. I have this shell. It's going to keep water within my body so I can be out of the water for a while. It can also attach me to rocks really well, and I can still find food sources. So there's like a happy medium there with zonation. And now we're going to start talking about the actual different zones. So for each of these, there's some information about the different zones and then what the factors are going to be like there day to day. The slides right after are specific organism adaptations, and we do need to have some named examples. Before I click away, just notice like your lower intertidals. This is your lower tidal zone. So intertidal, again, is the difference between your high tide and your low tide. So like the in between space. It's also known as a littoral zone. Littoral zone is your high spring tide to your low spring tide, but your lower intertidal zone is going to have water covering it majority of the time. You have this middle intertidal zone that is exposed equally throughout the day. Twice a day they're going to be exposed to air, twice a day they're going to be exposed to water, and they're going to spend an equal amount of time submerged and in the air. Higher intertidal zone, and then even higher than that is a splash zone. Those are going to be exposed more often throughout the day than they are submerged. So just a couple pictures here, just to give you some things to consider. Just looking at these, you can see that there are some patterns of how species are spacing themselves. Just a commonality you can identify between them is higher up in your tidal zones, you have mussels Right? These are bivalves. They're mollusks, so they have a shell, but they're bivalves. They have two shells, and they have the ability to close their shell so they can maintain moisture inside of it. That'll help avoid desiccation, and they attach themselves really strongly to the substrate. But I don't want to go through all the different adaptations because they're on the slide. But you can see these bands of zonation, right? There's a reason why you don't see the mussels in this first picture on the left living lower than they are. Believe when I was reading like the caption and the description of this is like these mussels are right at like the mid-tide line, and they're not going to go any lower. In the middle picture, again, we have a lot of mussels right around the laser pointer. Above that, you have lichen, again spelled like lichen, L-I-C-H-E-N, but that is an algae fungus mutualistic species. Below the mussels, we have some sea stars and a lot of anemones. I think there's also barnacles in there. I'm sure there's more in there that I just can't visually identify. And then on the left, same thing. We got a lot of mussels at the top, sea stars, and the sea stars can move. So, they can be moving throughout this entire zone. It's fine. We also have some algal species towards the bottom. The splash zone is going to be characterized as the area above the high tide mark. So where your tide is going to be highest, this is the part that's above that. It's called the splash zone because really organisms here are just like sprayed with water whenever the tide is high, and for the rest of the day they're left to dry out. So their best chances they're just getting like a mist or a spray of water from the waves. When you have high tide, that's it. This area is only submerged during spring tides and storm surges. So we're going to have a high spring tide twice a month. So they only are submerged twice a month, and then storm surges whenever there's going to be a storm surge. Sure. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Adaptations to be living in the splash zone. You can assume right now, like we just said that there's only going to be water on them, one just being splashed or at best submerged twice a month. So they are really well adapted to avoiding desiccation and not having to be in the water all the time. So their adaptations we can assume for sure they're going to have shells or something of the like because they need to be able to trap water. They need to be able to like close themselves off from being exposed to the air. 3 organisms examples that are in the splash zone. We have salt tolerant lichen. They need to be salt tolerant because they're living at the beach. But these are just these little orange organisms that you see covering the rocks, and we've seen them in the previous pictures. They are on the top part of your high tide zones. This is a mutualistic relationship between algae and fungus, and I know I mentioned it in class a couple weeks ago, but this may have been something that you talked about when you talked about succession and pioneer species and ecosystems when you did regular biology. Periwinkles. Cambridge loves a sweet little periwinkle. They are just these little snails, mollusks. They're snails that are on this rock in this bottom right picture, but they have this muscular foot and allows them to clamp onto rocks. They can attach really well. They can survive without food or water for days because they can trap some water within their shell. And as long as that water is oxygenated, they can have it just, flow past their gills, and they're able to extract oxygen out of it and still maintain doing cellular respiration. Limpets. I showed you guys the limpets in class not that long ago. We don't have limpets because we have a sandy shore. But limpets are another mollusk, so they are a shelled species, and they're flattened. The flattening or like the flat shape that they have, it definitely helps to avoid such force of waves like coming onto them. Like the flatter they are, the more the waves can go over it. It definitely helps for reducing like the drag of water on them when the waves are crashing. They also will clamp their shells to a rock and they like will seal in. They're gonna seal. Limit myself. They're gonna seal in the water during the like driest parts of the day. And you can see on the rock here on the left that they have formed a home scar, and that is unique to those limpets. That is the place that they retreat to all the time. They're literally putting in like a marking on there. So this is an example of organic weathering. And same thing on the picture in the top right, top left. There's limpets there as well. So the organisms and the adaptations that they have in the splash zone. Okay, the high tide zone or the upper shore. This is going to be where the high tide is. This is below the splash zone. This is only submerged during high tides. Organisms must be adapted to it, must be able to adapt to long periods of being without food, without water, and definitely being able to adapt to drastic changes in temperature. At low tides, desiccation is definitely a risk because they will be exposed to the air for a while. When the tides return, the organisms need to like withstand like the pool of water whenever the tide's coming back in, because that could be like quite a rush and some strong like hydrodynamic pressure on them. I know there's a lot of details. It won't be like this every time. But organism adaptations in the upper shore, or also called the high tide zone. There's barnacles. We'll talk about barnacles whenever we talk about the next zone, but barnacles, limpets again, sweet little periwinkles. And something to keep in mind, like limpets and periwinkles, they're able to move. So you can see them within different zones. They're able to move, which is good. Some of these organisms cannot move. Chitons is the next one. These are a mollusk, but they're a snail, so it doesn't matter. Like they have a shell. That's what a mollusk is. They use their muscular foot again to clamp down on rocks to prevent waves from moving them and to stop predation. The other thing that also was a snail species that had a muscular foot was the periwinkle. They also can trap water in their shells, and that is going to help them avoid desiccation. That is also same way going to help them do gas exchange because they don't have lungs, they're going to have gills, and this is going to help keep water flowing like past their gills so they can extract oxygen from the water. Will also help them maintain their temperature. If they have a little bit of water inside of them, it'll help them cool down. Channeled rack. Oh, okay. For some reason, I'm like, did I spell that wrong? It's 2 L's, 1 L. It's fine. These are a type of algae. They avoid desiccation despite being out of the water for up to 8 hours. So they're fronds, which you can assume, like consider they're going to be like leaves, but they are fronds. Whenever the water is gone, they're exposed and the tide is low, they can like roll up their fronds so that there is not so much being exposed and they're able to like decrease their surface area that's exposed to the air. That helps minimize water loss through evaporation. They have channels in them, and I tried to like scour for a picture that showed those channels. Like right here, you can see a nice channel going through them, which is freaking brilliant because when water does get on them, when they are submerged at high tide, and then the water starts to retreat back, it's going to low tide, the water will get trapped within those channels and like travel down through them. So it does help them like collect or trap water within their own tissues. They can lose up to 90% of their water whenever there is a low tide, and in 25 minutes they can rehydrate. Way to go. Getting a little bit lower, we are in the mid-tide zone. So this one's like the best of both worlds, but it's not the best. But if you had to choose 50-50, this is it. This area is exposed to air twice a day, and they must still be able to avoid desiccation. So they can't get too cozy in their submerged environment because half the time they're also going to be exposed to the air. Not as long as the high tide, and absolutely not as long as the splash zone. Adaptations here, and there isn't another slide with organism adaptations like this. Scout's honor. So some adaptations here. We have brown algae, limpets, again, periwinkles. These things can move. Blue mussels are the example here. So they will attach themselves to the shore by producing this protein-rich, fibrous thread that attaches them to the rocks. And you can see it here in this picture in the bottom, like left middle. And then they are a bivalve, so they have two shells, and they can close their shell, clamp it really, really tightly shut, and that will trap any water in it. Same reasons, to maintain temperature control, to stop desiccation, and help them. They don't have gills, but they do just do gas exchange directly through their tissues because they're very thin, and they can do that. They can do just straight up diffusion. Barnacles. Barnacles are crustaceans. So they are like a same kind of similar organism as, I feel like I'm just mumbling, like crabs and lobsters. They are also in the crustacean family. They cement themselves as larvae. So when they're larvae, they will float through the water as zooplankton. And then when they find a hard substrate, hopefully that's exactly what they're landing on, because that would be such a shame, because once you cement yourself, that's it. But they, as larvae, they will find a hard substrate, cement themselves, and then they'll start to metamorphose into an adult form. And then there they stay forever. So these two can't move from their zone. So you're not going to see them in many other zones. When the tide is in, the water will encourage the barnacle to release its little like feather-like feet, and just like a straw feeds through the water column and feeds on like zooplankton, which again are like animal larvae, or phytoplankton, which are your floating producers. And they do this just by opening up their shell. So they open up their little shell. To me, they always look like a beak, depending on how big your screen is. Like in here, I always see it like a little beak, but they can open it, and then there come their little fibrous feet to help filter feed. When the tide is out, they're going to shut their shell because they do not want to have desiccation occur. You may have heard about like the barnacles and the whales is perhaps like a commensalistic relationship. I'm just bringing that up to just jog your mind that you may have heard about barnacles that way. But having them grow on an organism, sometimes we see people like rescue turtles and like pluck them off of the turtle shell. Pluck is kind, scrape them off of a turtle shell. But it's not a bad idea if you're a barnacle, because these are organisms that are constantly swimming, and you just need to like open up your shell, send out your feather-like feet, and just, enjoy the current. And it's none of your own energy that has to do this. It's all from the organism that you attach yourself to. Almost done. We just have this one, and then tide pools. So the lower shore, or your low tide zone, this is going to be even more comfortable. But this is always covered with water, except for your low spring tides. So twice a month, they're going to be exposed to the air. Versus your splash zone that is exposed to the air all the time, except during your high spring tides, then they're submerged in water. So this is kind of like the opposite of that. But in terms of being in a rocky shore and being a marine habitat, this is probably the place you'd want to be. You just need to avoid predation and competition. Organisms here have very few adaptations to live outside of the water. Makes sense, because they're typically not outside of the water. So the times that they are outside of the water, obviously they're going to survive it because, one, they're still here, and two, they choose to live there. Species are not going to place themselves in areas where there's going to be like a guaranteed death. That would be terrible for that species, like evolution. So very few adaptations. A lot of these are going to be more soft-bodied organisms. Maybe they can move so that if it does start to get like a stressful environment and you're exposed too long, then you can go to a lower part of the shore, or maybe even just like find a tide pool, hopefully. Anyway, they desiccate and they overheat very easily. So a lot of your shelled organisms are not going to be here. They don't want to compete with the soft bodies. They don't want to. They're going to be like, okay, like there's not enough room here. I get it. Well, I have this shell I can close. I can move higher up on the shore. I'm going to survive. I'm still going to be able to feed. I'm going to have water, and I'm also going to be able to do gas exchange. So bye. The conditions here are most stable. So there is a greater biodiversity and a greater abundance of organisms. You have a lot of different species, hence the biodiversity, and you do have an abundance of them. So there are large numbers of them. All right, the organisms in the low tide zone. Notice that I didn't say adaptations because, as we said on the other slide, they really don't have adaptations. It doesn't really take a lot to be able to live in a wonderful place. They don't really need to be having a shell. They shouldn't be exposed. If they are exposed to the air, then hopefully they get themselves in a tide pool or moving deeper down the shore. But they've earned their spot here. It's pretty dominant species to live in this low tide zone, and they are covered almost all the time except for your spring low tides. Organisms here are seaweeds, sea urchins, oysters, sea stars, and sea anemones. And they are sea stars. They're not starfish. They are not fish. There's a lot about fish that they are not. And sea stars are echinoderms. They are not fish. Here's your urchins. This is what Olive mistakenly thought was coral. God bless her heart. Yeah, there's your urchins. Those are also echinoderms. And these are the ones in the top right. Sea stars are throughout all of these. Hopefully you've maybe taken a comparison and saw that they're very prevalent here. They can move. They are soft bodies. We don't want them to be just exposed to the air. Bottom left, the sea star is crawling over a limpet. Cute little thing. This is actually a super common GIF. Every time that I look for one, if I like Google search like sea star or anemone, the anemone saving itself and escaping predation is a very popular GIF, I guess, in like the marine biology world. But here it is, like just hopping out of the way. It always reminds me of like those waving arm tube men, like if they had to get out of danger or something. I don't know. Anyway. And the last one is an anemone, and it is escaping predation from a crab. Last section, the tide pools, which is literally why rocky shores are so much better than sandy shores. Because in every zone, the high upper shore zone, the high tide upper shore zone, your middle zone, and your lower shore low tide zone. In any of those, you could have rocks shaped in such a way that when waves crash on it or the tide goes out, that water collects in it and it creates like a little tide pool, or they're also called rock pools. So those create like these like little mini like ocean habitats for the time that they're going to be exposed to the air. And this is why the rocky shore can honestly maintain a lot of its, oh, excuse me, I'm getting on. This is cool, almost done. All right, this is why the rocky shore can maintain its biodiversity, because there is some sense of normalcy whenever the tide does go out, because this substrate is able to maintain water within it. It's not porous. These rocks are not, it's not like broken chunks. Sure, some of them are, but the substrate is rocky at the bottom. And so water's not going to go through it. Obviously not, or these things wouldn't form. But yeah, they are like important little marine habitats. They allow them to carry out gas exchange because these organisms need to breathe through the water. They need to exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide in the water. And it allows them to maintain some normal temperature control. They're still able to feed throughout the water when they're in a tide pool. The longer the tide is out, though, the warmer that the temperature in that tide pool can get. You guys actually had an exam question about this when you guys had section like 2.2, and it was about solubility and the effect that high temperatures in a lagoon would have on organisms there. Because ultimately those high temperatures are going to increase the temperature of the water. High water temperatures are going to cause more evaporation. If we're losing fresh water due to evaporation, then salinity is going to increase. High salinity does not hold oxygen well. Additionally, warm water doesn't hold temperature well. Doesn't hold gases well or oxygen well. And so I'd always ask you guys, like, how do you drink your soda? You like to drink it cold, cool, because it's carbonated, and you want those carbonations, like those gas bubbles, to stay dissolved or else it'll go flat. Keeping things cold will allow gases to stay dissolved in it. So when the tide pool does get really warm and it does lose water due to evaporation, salinity goes up. Obviously, the temperature of the water is going to go up. Both of those things are going to cause oxygen concentration to be low. The other thing is, this is a biodiverse area, and you're going to have organisms that are just living their best life and thriving in the tide pool. And while they're doing that, they're using up some of that available oxygen so that they can live and they can continue to do cellular respiration, synthesize ATP. And that is going to be a third reason why that these tide pools can lose dissolved oxygen within them. Okay, and so like I said, this isn't specific to really just any one of those zones. Any of those zones could collect water, just depends on how those rocks are shaped. So I made sure to include a picture of, higher up in your shoreline, in your high tide area. Could even be the splash zone. I can't say for sure because I can't see what's behind it, but you can tell that this is relatively high up in the left picture, but you have water pooling here. A very quick time lapse on the high right side. And then in this one, the bottom right, there is an octopus. Looks like it's trying to feed on fish that are caught in the rock pool. There's also a lot of little crevices for organisms to hide, and larger predators might not be able to get in those crevices. That'll do it for Rocky Shore ecosystems. It's officially at 12:08 a.m. on March 1st. So that officially means that your exam is next. It's fine. We're doing great. We're making great progress. You're making great progress. Hopefully you're getting this done this weekend. Because we're gonna do it on Monday and Tuesday. Hopefully not Wednesday, but we never know. Probably Wednesday, because there's gonna be SATs on Tuesday. Anyways, so Rocky Shores, strong wave action, and depending on the slope of the shoreline, we could have very strong changes in conditions and exposure to the air. Rocky Shores do have a lot of sunlight, and as always, we're gonna be wearing our sunscreen all the time. I didn't say it in class, but this week I did go to get a full skin check to make sure there wasn't anything else creeping around, and nothing else was found. So amen to that. And the first 2 people from each class that send me a message and remind or something motivational and just uplifting. So at least I know that you've watched all the way to the end and you didn't just copy off somebody who did it. I'll throw on some extra points for this. See you guys in the morning.